1918. After 4 grueling years of total war, the German Empire was a shadow of its former self. Its once proud cities were gripped by hunger. Its seemingly invincible army was exhausted, worn down by endless trench warfare. One by one, its allies, the Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria, Austria-Hungary, were collapsing, leaving Germany increasingly isolated on the world stage. The writing was on the wall. Yet in the halls of power, far from the mud and blood of the front lines, the German High Command refused to read it. They stood at a momentous crossroads. One path led to a negotiated peace, a chance to salvage what was left and begin the long, painful process of rebuilding. The other path, a monumental gamble, a final, desperate roll of the dice to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. Germany chose the gamble. This fateful decision was unmade by the soldiers shivering in the trenches or the generals staring at tactical maps. It was made by the supreme leadership, men like Erich Ludendorff and Paul von Hindenburg, who had become the de facto dictators of Germany. They were driven by a powerful, yet ultimately delusional, belief. They believed one more massive offensive, one last push, could shatter the Allied lines and force a favorable peace before the full might of the United States could be brought to bear. It was a desperate hope, born of pride and an unwillingness to accept the grim reality of their situation. The plan was codenamed Operation Michael, the start of what would be known as the Spring Offensive. In the early spring of 1918, Germany unleashed its storm. A storm of artillery, gas, and highly trained stormtroopers. They threw everything they had left at the Western Front, and at first it was shockingly effective. The Allied lines, unprepared for the ferocity and new tactics of the assault, buckled and then broke. German soldiers poured through the gaps, advancing further than they had in years. For a fleeting, intoxicating moment, the scent of victory was in the air again. Newspapers in Berlin proclaimed a decisive breakthrough. It seemed the gamble might just pay off. But this initial success was a mirage, masking a devastating truth. The cost of the offensive was astronomical. Germany sacrificed its most experienced, battle-hardened soldiers, the very stormtroopers who had engineered the breakthrough. They were irreplaceable. As the German army pushed deeper into enemy territory, their supply lines stretched to the breaking point. The soldiers advancing through captured Allied trenches were stunned to find them stocked with food, cigarettes, and luxuries they hadn't seen in years. The sight was a crushing blow to morale, a stark reminder of how well supplied their enemies were and how dire their own situation had become. The offensive began to slow, bogged down by exhaustion and a lack of resources. The initial momentum vanished, replaced by the grim, familiar stalemate of attrition warfare. And all the while, a new, formidable force was arriving on the continent. Troopships carrying fresh, enthusiastic American soldiers were docking in French ports every single day. They were called doughboys, and they were arriving in overwhelming numbers, a seemingly endless tide of men and materiel. The balance of power on the Western Front was shifting, rapidly and decisively. While Germany struggled to replace its catastrophic losses, the Allies were being reinforced by the industrial and demographic might of the United States. By the summer of 1918, the strategic situation was no longer ambiguous. The spring offensive had failed. Germany was spent. Defeat was not just likely, it was mathematically certain. Any rational analysis would have concluded that the war had to end. But Germany did not end the war. The leadership, clinging to power and terrified of admitting failure, chose to continue the fight. They sent boys and old men to the front, sacrificing the last of the nation's strength in a conflict that was already lost. This decision would have catastrophic consequences, not just on the battlefield, but within Germany itself. As the army was being bled dry in France, the home front imploded. The Allied naval blockade had strangled the German economy for years, and now the system finally broke. Food shortages became critical. The German people were literally starving. Unrest, which had been simmering for years, boiled over into open rebellion. In major cities, workers laid down their tools and went on strike, demanding peace and food. The final straw came in late October. The German Naval Command, in a final act of suicidal pride, ordered the High Seas Fleet to sail out for one last battle against the British Royal Navy. It was a death ride. And the sailors knew it. They refused the order. The Kiel Mutiny began as sailors took control of their ships and naval bases. The mutiny spread like wildfire, igniting revolutionary sparks across the country. The German Empire was not just losing a war, it was disintegrating from within. Faced with military defeat and revolution at home, the German leadership made one last cynical decision. They needed a scapegoat. They could not and would not accept responsibility for the catastrophe they had orchestrated. So, as the empire crumbled around them, they began to craft a poisonous lie, a myth. The stab in the back myth. The narrative they promoted was that the German army had not been defeated on the battlefield. It was undefeated in the field, they claimed. Instead, it had been betrayed, stabbed in the back by weak-willed politicians, striking workers and revolutionaries on the home front. It was a pernicious and dangerous falsehood, but it allowed the military leadership to evade blame and preserve their tarnished honor. This lie would take root in the fertile soil of national humiliation and would poison German politics for decades to come. On November 9, 1918, the chaos reached its peak. The Kaiser, Wilhelm II, abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. The centuries-old German monarchy was gone. In Berlin, a new German republic, later known as the Weimar Republic, was declared from a balcony of the Reichstag. It was a republic born in the crucible of defeat, humiliation, and internal collapse. 2 days later, on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, an armistice was signed in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne. The guns of the Great War finally fell silent. Germany had not fallen because it was weak. In 1914, it possessed one of the most powerful armies in the world. It fell because its leaders refused to recognize when the war was lost. It fell because it chose pride over reality, gambling the nation's future on a war that could no longer be won. The empire's final, desperate decisions did more than just end a war. By refusing to seek peace when it was still possible, and by creating the stab-in-the-back myth to cover their failures, Germany's leaders sowed the seeds of future conflict. The resentment, instability, and anger that festered in the post-war years would create the perfect environment for extremist ideologies to flourish, ultimately leading the world down the path to another, even more devastating, war just 2 decades later. The story of Germany in 1918 is a chilling reminder. Empires do not always fall with a climactic final battle. Sometimes they crumble from within when their leaders refuse to accept that the battle is already over. Thank you for watching. If you found this piece of history as fascinating as I do, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more stories about the pivotal moments that shaped our world. See you next time.